Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. The London Chess Classic got off to a sluggish start, but I'll tell you who I think fought the hardest in the first two rounds. We will also look at a near upset in the concurrent British Knockout Championship, and finally enjoy a spectacular early game from the Russian Superfinal. All right, the usual suspects are playing in the London Classic, which is a 10-player round robin. None of the games from the first two rounds produced a decisive result. I think that Hikaru Nakamura at least came close. So we'll look at how his tournament started. First, he played white against Anand, and the game was not necessarily so special from the beginning, but it got pretty tactical. So it's a kind of a type of reverse Grunfeld. So because, Grunfeld is a dynamic opening, having that extra tempo will really take away those chances for advantage to get an active position. On the other hand, black having the white setup, because he's black, there isn't the onus to get an advantage, really, if he can equalize. And so he doesn't even try to maintain the pawn on d4. He's just trying to equalize. And it does seem that Anand managed that. He did give up the bishop pair, but of course the white bishops are a little bit locked in. So we're going to really kind of go pretty much quickly through it until we get to the kind of the major parts of the game. Bishop f1, chasing the rook back. Of course, in this type of position, you love to take on e3 and then get the bishop on the diagonal, but he's not quite set up for it, so he goes back. And Hikaru starts pushing the kingside pawns. Give him credit for playing boldly, but probably backfires a little bit, and Anand starts to get the advantage. And just a simple retreat leaves black in good shape because the g5 pawn is going to collapse. Knight comes to d5, f4, bishop f4. Okay, here Vichy takes with the bishop on g5, which is perhaps more natural, although it does let the queen come in. And the computer suggests that maybe knight takes was better. Okay, knight takes can be answered by rook c3, which not only defends h2, drives the queen away. So black has to see how we can answer the pending knight takes e7, and then the knight might hang. But black can play queen b5. So if white takes an e7, black can take back with a knight and defend on g5. And then you could see, if you try to chase the queen away, bishop f1, queen a4, knight e7, black can throw in this check, and white wants to avoid a check, and then queen takes e4, threatening mate down in h1. So black, with some tricky tactics. So knight takes was perhaps stronger, but on the surface it looks like there could be something wrong with it. Computers see all these little finer points. So bishop takes. Black is still doing fine, although not necessarily crushing it. Okay, so after bishop g2, all right, now he has to be careful because white is threatening to get the rook in position. Rook c3 is one idea. Rook h1 is another. So black has to play knight h7, although it's a good move. And queen takes f7. And now, according to the engine, black should take on b2 right away. And a finer point is that if rook c3, black can play rook takes d5. And the rook on c3 hangs. Black will be up pawns in endgame. Rook h3 is answered by rook h5. So queen takes b2 is more exact. And the reason is that the rook f8 in the game could have been answered by rook c3, counterattacking the queen. And that would lead to some simplification. Black takes a rook, white can throw in queen takes rook with check, and we get to an ending with even pawns. But, Nakamura is a very combative player, so he may have seen that and decided just to take a chance at the queen c7. But objectively, black is better in this position. Queen b2, rook h1, and now queen f2, crowding the white position. So white struggling to get a check, trying to get king g4 to mate black with a discovered check with a king. But black is not having that so easily. Rook f7, so the king can come back. Queen g3. And here, Vichy should have been content with just holding an advantage with a move like king g7, allowing the endgame, just playing the ending with an extra pawn. But he wanted a little bit too much with queen b2. And now with knight e3, white gets a lot of counterplay. Queen d4 seems to preserve some advantage, though not so obvious. Move played in the game, knight f6, bishop f3, king h7, and now a very cool move, knight f5, draw, end of game. Looks like kind of a very sharp move to end the game. But the draw is kind of legitimate. There are many ways it could happen. The computer zeroes out just about everything. For instance, queen takes a3 is possible, king g2, knight h5. So if white takes on h5, black can trade queens. And if white moves the queen, black can check, 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 draw. In fact, even if black takes the knight, and well, that is a good question, right? Why can't black just take the knight? Well, then comes rook h2, and if the queen moves away, king g2, and white does get that killer check on the h file. But even here, black could take the queen and take on e4. And white has a queen for a rook and knight, but it's going to be a fortress because white is almost out of pawns. So a fighting draw, a strange moment for the game to end with that really sharp move. But actually, in terms of the judgment of the position was legitimate. Okay, so after that, Nakamura next played Vachel Grave and essayed the Modern Dragon, which has really kind of been absent at the highest levels for a long time. So let's see how he and MVL, how Nakamura and MVL traded punches in the Yugoslav attack. Okay, so Dragon and MVL does not shy away from the fight. I guess, every now and then you might tend to think, well, is my opponent, current on his dragon, but not that much is changing, so it's maybe easier than you might think. These guys tend not to forget a whole lot. All right, h4 is an interesting move. I know that they used to play h4 early in the dragon, but I think nowadays white, plays castles and bishop b3 and those moves first, because there is one main line where white delays this move. It's generally almost always met by h5, making white work to get the open lines, at least sacrifice some stuff. And then it's standard continuation, and bishop g5 is one of the main moves, perhaps the most main moves, the mainest of the main moves. But the game kind of leaves theory fairly quickly. After bishop g5, we see rook c5, and that I remember is also pretty standard. King b1. Sometimes there's a little bit of a waiting game. White is getting ready to play g4, but this is a useful move, so black kind of waits too, and also getting out of the way of bishop h6, trading the bishops. So white comes forward, chases the knight, and queen d3. There were also a number of games with the queen going to e2. And queen d3, Nakamura's reaction maybe isn't the best. Most people have played Queen C8, not a ton of games actually from this position, but Queen C8 is the usual continuation. And here, what Vashi did in the game with Bishop F6, Black can take with the bishop, and E5 doesn't have the same effect because the knight stays on C4, so the bishop on B3 is blocked out. In the game, Nakamura played knight A5, which is perhaps slightly iffy after bishop takes F6. Now bishop takes F6, white can play E5, and if D takes E5, whoops, queen takes G6, scary, right? F pawn is pinned. Black can play knight takes B3 here, but it does seem that white is getting the better of it. He can take with the knight and attack the rook, I think. So for that reason, he takes with the pawn, and now bishop d5, okay, our Silicon friend suggests f5 here to make sure that the bishop is blocked out. Bishop d5 could have been met with f5, pawn takes pawn, bishop c6. Of course, extremely complicated, and the last I saw it running, Komodo was saying equal. It's one of those things where I could run it for 5 minutes, and maybe if I let it run another 10 minutes, it will be different. But of course, if you're a human being, who knows what to think of these positions. But anyway, he just retreated knight back to c6, and he took on c6, and then they head for an ending. It seems that white's best chance for advantage was to move knight b5 with with some complications, but looking to take that pawn on d6, and black can't easily defend it, and the white can turn his attention to playing for an attack on the king side again, maybe get in f5 and block out the bishop. But knight takes c6, well, a more obvious continuation, certainly from a human perspective, and fairly safe. But black should be okay here. One thing Hikaru could have done is rook h5. He could have entered the ending in this way, and king g8, and this seems in the neighborhood of equals. In this line, black keeps the bishop against the knight, which could be an advantage in the endgame. All right, instead, he went rook takes c3, takes, and now to avoid being down in the exchange and ending king e6, rook g7. But this position seems to be about equal. White is nominally a pawn up, but the problem is black has the better pawn. His passed pawn is going to be faster. It's supported by the king, and that is certainly going to give a lot of compensation. Okay, so black started getting the f pawn going, and now he gives white an opportunity to liquidate the f pawn. Instead of rook e8, he could have played king e3, and I think he was just going to go rook h2, and they could get a position like this, and king back. This is a very thematic ending, probably happens slightly more often the other side, but the knight and rook pawn against bishop pawn, it's not the conventional 2-on-1. White has the passed pawn, and this ending is won occasionally. I've seen some wins scored. It should be a draw, but certainly if you have opportunity to play it, you don't mind. Vachier, I guess, thought that maybe he had more chances to try to keep things complicated, but Nakamura ends up forcing the draw. And first he brings his king in to support. Rook h1 threatened to queen the pawn. Gives a couple of checks. Okay, a couple of checks, but how to make progress. Eventually he decides to play b4 and sacrifice the rook, but it's kind of, I think, a token winning attempt, really, because black is able to liquidate the pawns. Vachier didn't take too many chances there. King takes c6, and black can take c2. White can certainly win the black rook with passed pawn, but he's not able to maintain both pawns. So they agreed to a draw. So some fighting chess by Nakamura, but two draws. Hey, they won't all be draws forever. So next week we should have something more interesting, or at least more decisive from that event. Now, alongside the main event, there are other competitions. England's top grandmasters have been duking it out in the British Knockout Championship. Nigel Short got through his first match against young IM Alan Mary 2-0, but the match was easier on paper than on the board, as we shall see next. So Short played white in the first game, and I noticed that Nigel has been playing a lot of systems. I guess maybe he just doesn't want to have to study openings. He spent so much time traveling. When is he going to study? So, but Mary doesn't seem to be too phased by it. With C4, he grabs some space, and so Nigel plays kind of the obvious plan to break with E4, but it's not all that successful, as Black gets the D5 square that he can really use to attack this backward and vulnerable C3 pawn. And now Nigel makes a controversial decision with bishop takes F6. It gives us the bishop pair. Okay, so if he can reach an ending, he can trade off all the pieces and reach an ending. He's in great shape with a healthy majority. But in the meantime, Black has a D5 square, and his light square bishop is now operating very well. Maybe Nigel had some dreams of trading it off, but he doesn't get there. And after bishop E4, all right, in this position, knight takes C3 would be a blunder, which Mary avoids because white temporarily sacrifices the queen, but then gets it back and ends up ahead material. So he would not do that. But instead, he can play F5, and that's a perfectly good position. But probably even better was the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes E4. So queen takes E4 with the pin, trying not to lose the C3 pawn. But Black does get to take B4. And although that doesn't right away collapse that pawn structure, Black now has potentially B4 push. And this is one of those positions where it's just, kind of clearly good compensation for the exchange. One pawn, but all these positional factors. White has weaknesses. Black has the bishop pair. All good squares. So H5, he has the idea to put the bishop to H6. And Nigel is really kind of swimming around here a bit, trying to stabilize things. And Black in a position with many good moves, but what he did was fine for a while. H4, well, he's trying to get some counterplay with knight H3 and knight G5 potentially weakening. Rook E2, and now the bishop comes in, queen E1, and that's where it goes wrong. Now in this position, B4 is pretty strong. If pawn takes C3 is probably the best. Bishop B5 is not bad either. So Black has ideas of bishop B5. D4 pawn is loose. Knight takes B4 could be coming. Remember, the queen is right now a little bit tied down to the H4 pawn, and this is probably a winning position for Black with proper play. Here, Alan Mary, he plays as bad a mistake as you can make without obviously hanging something or allowing checkmate, because the position goes from a winning advantage for Black to a clear advantage for White. And this is why, because he takes off the pressure. White is all blocked in the E-file. So White trades and forces the knight back. And now he picks up more momentum chasing the bishop. And now he gets to take on A6. So the position completely transforms in a handful of moves. And now, okay, Mary has his desperation play. But unfortunately, now Nigel has his passed A pawn. And Nigel knows what to do with the passed A pawn. He just shoved it as far as it would go. And now he sets about queening it. And he manages to do that before Black has time to break through in the king side. So Black has some impressive pressure there, but unfortunately White is about to make a queen. And he does so, threatening mate in the process. and that's the end of the game. So the wheels came off quickly for Alan Mary, who actually lost quite a bit more convincingly in the second game. So that they've gone a bit further in that tournament. That was the first game, and as I said, Nigel won that 2-0, but then he lost in the second round in the hands of Luke McShane. David Howell defeated Matthew Sadler to become the other finalist, and next week I can let you know how that turned out. Moving on to the Russian Superfinal, which is missing several of the usual suspects, Kramnik, Grishuk, and two of the players in London, Karyakin and Nepomniachtchi. Still, without these marquee names, it is still a powerhouse event, and we will see some of the younger players make a name for themselves. One player who got off to a brilliant start is Daniil Dubov, who notched an impressive victory over Sergei Volkov in the first round. So we have a Slav, an A6. This is a line that has been popular for periods over several years. I've kind of come to the conclusion it's probably not as good as some of the other lines in the Slav, but Queen C2, okay. Daniil Dubov has a very interesting idea, E4, and I have to admit I was not really familiar with this, but it has been played about 10 times, and in fact Volkov has been on the black side a few times, but it really shows 21st century gambit play, because you think about 19th century gambits, how they basically would bring out pieces and leave pawns to be taken, mostly by other pawns, and then they try for a very quick checkmate. But nowadays, you see players very often just not caring about the pawn count and getting just trying to accumulate a central advantage or whatever compensation for a pawn. And one of the big ideas is this is a little bit similar to some Queen's Gambit Accepted, the position we're going to get, where White displays knight f3, knight c3, and e4. Now, after e4, Black has a choice here. There is a move b4, and Volkov has played that himself a few times. Knight a4, d e4, knight e5. It seems like White is getting some pretty good compensation. I suppose the idea would be queen takes d4. It's not as strong as you might think because of bishop e3. Maybe even knight takes f7 works. You know, I didn't actually calculate this, but the idea is the knight comes into b6, and the Black could play bishop b7, you know. So maybe he could try queen takes d4, but he didn't play it in any of the games, so I'm pretty sure that maybe just bishop f4 and rook d1, yeah. So in the games he played, after knight e5, he played, I think, bishop f5 in one of the games, and I forget what he did in the other, but b4 looks a little bit iffy to me. I think what he did here is better. D takes c4. B takes c4. White can play e5, and the knight can go back to g8, and even that's possible, just to try to hold the line in the center. But he takes takes c4. This has been played in a number of games as well. And after b3, I think there's a good alternative in b4. And if knight d1, c3. It's been played in a couple of games. I mean, literally a couple of games, as in two. And they both went this far. Bishop a3, c5, takes, 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 now simply castles. So White takes on c3. So White gets a pawn out of it, but I don't think he's able to hold it. I think Black is going to attack c5, and it's going to be very hard for White to really hold on to the material because he's a few moves behind in development, and Black managed okay in 2 games, and computer says he's about equal. So maybe that's actually better than queen a5, which has been played more often, but now Dubov plays a novelty knight d2, but it's a move that makes a lot of sense. Now b4 is prevented by a knight takes c4, hitting the queen. Black takes on b3, you can take with a knight, picking up a tempo. White is ready to take on c4 now. So e5, this seems to be indicated. And white starts developing. Now around here, maybe black can improve. It's hard to say what exactly he should do. Maybe bishop b6, dispensing with bishop b7 for a while. But okay, we get to this position, and white is probably doing pretty well with a number of moves. But knight d5, he gets it on, gets it going. Knight d5, black accepts the sacrifice, and white takes with the c pawn. I think this probably seems more natural than e takes, which is also possible because, white has this idea that he's going to push forward with c5. So this seems to give good compensation as well. Queen c7, maybe just something like rook c1. And it's hard for black to manage. But I think what he did was more straightforward. He took with the c pawn. The bishop can't go to c8. That's a possibility in the other line because it hangs. It's bishop d7. So now the knight in b8 has no square. So bishop b2. And now he starts pushing these pawns forward, getting ready for e5. So Volkov tries to slow down the momentum by trading a piece. And now just quietly, king h1, getting out of the nasty check. He's getting ready to push e5. All right, so black tries to slow white down a little bit. And Dubois pretty much plays the best move on every turn, which is pretty cool. e5. And black has this extra piece, but white is steamrolling through the center. And black is really not in a position to give up a piece for more than one pawn. And then white is going to still have a pass pawn in the center. He tries rook c8 and a3. That's also a strong move. Takes. Queen b3, queen d4. And now c3 led to really the position starting to go really bad. But white is certainly better. The engine suggests knight c6. And then the best move is just to move away. Queen e8, bishop e8, and then white can play d6. And those pawns, advanced pawns seem to be worth more than a piece. But black would be much more in the game. After c3, rook fb1. All right, white has a winning position now, and Volkov got a little desperate and gave up his queen. Why? Well, if queen c2, bishop d3, queen to d2, now problem is white sets up this battery and now takes. So immediate tactical problems, queen e6, and you think like, well, okay, maybe it's not that bad, but the second rank. If queen takes d3, rook b7, and you can't defend these mates. What's interesting is that if black improves slightly after queen d7 with c2, so if bishop takes c2, rook takes c2, threatens mate on g2, at least keeps the game going, but white can play rook b7 here, and if, all right, let's make a queen, bishop f1, avoiding mate, and even with the extra queen, black is helpless with the mate threat, and he has to give back lots of material and come out of it a piece behind. So that's kind of a nice line there. I think slightly less obvious is queen a4. White can take, and the problem is black can't develop the knight. He has to take back with the queen, and d6. And this one is certainly less obvious, but the problem is that black just does not have an effective blockade at all. The light square bishop is really good, and black is going to have trouble in all those open white diagonals. So it's one where white probably has a winning position, although it's, it takes some time and variations to really fully appreciate it. But I guess Volkov found that too depressing, and he decided to try for some trickery with a4. But Dubois was ready for that. And so black has these wonderful passed pawns, but white also still has a lot of threats of his own. So black doesn't get a chance to enjoy them so much. Okay, the best try maybe is rook takes a3, and white doesn't need to take that. Rook doesn't want to let black queen, especially with mate. So rook g1, c2, and now queen b2. And it could go like this: rook a2, queen b3, black making a queen again, and white just simply taking the rook. And I think white is actually going to win this knight now, or an exchange or something, and just with a winning position, completely winning position. So the game ended with b2, and then the rook just went to safe square. The pawns are stopped for now. Black tried to get them going. Of course, white doesn't want to just let the pawn queen when he can't take it because of mate, so he's able to blockade. The blockade is pretty airtight, and white just has to be just a little bit careful and he doesn't blunder. Queen b7, very strong. And now just one last trap. If queen takes d7, rook takes b1, and black actually wins because the pawns are now too strong, and there's back rank mate threats as well. Rook takes rook c2, and black is gonna queen and possibly mate. But Dubov, of course, avoided that. He played d6, useful move. There's no rook takes bishop because queen takes rook on a check. So basically black waited. Okay, white could play h3 even, but at any point. But he comes back and checks, and that's that because he's going to take the pawn on c3, and black is going to run out of ammunition. So very nice win for Dubov. Not necessarily that he played any one amazing move, but the fact that he played, creatively in the opening, and it was, willing to make that sacrifice, slightly intuitive sacrifice, and really pressed the game nicely. Just won in very good style. He also won in the second round over Peter Svidler, who's probably the biggest name in the event, and he has been matched so far by Vladimir Fedoseev, a very strong young grandmaster who has beaten Ryazantsov and Tomaszewski. Now, the Classic and Superfinal are both in their early stages, so we will see how they progress. The Classic will be over by next week's show, while the Superfinal will continue into the 15th. Okay, everyone, I hope you all enjoyed the show. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Please join me again next week for GM Joel's Chess Week recap on ICC.